Senator Harry Reid has died at the age of 82. Reid, a Democrat, served as a U.S. Senator representing Nevada from 1987 to 2017. He was Majority Leader from 2007 to 2015 before getting elected to the Senate. Reid served in the U.S. House of Representatives for 2 terms. He began his over 5 decades-long political career in Nevada politics as a state representative before becoming lieutenant governor. As a young man, he was also an amateur boxer. Las Vegas's airport was renamed Harry Reid International Airport earlier this month. Reid called it, quote, the greatest of honors. Reid is survived by his wife of more than 60 years and their 5 children. Joining us by phone for more is CBS News political contributor and Democratic strategist Joel Payne. Joel, thank you so much for joining us. Senator Reid stepped out of the limelight a few years ago, yet he continued to be very much involved in the political process. How so?
Well, thank you, Elise, for having me. And, I should share with the viewers and the listeners, I worked for Harry Reid for 2 years, 2009, 10, and 11. During the first 2 years of President Obama's term. And, the people of Nevada are hurting tonight, but, the people of this country have really lost a champion. He was a progressive champion, but he was also a son of the West. He was somebody who understood the body that I grew up in, the United States Senate, as well as anybody, better than anybody. There was really no match on the Democratic side for his understanding of Senate rules, the Senate language, the ways of the body. The time that I worked for him in 2009 and 10 and 11 were among the most productive times for Democrats, in the leadership of the United States Senate in the last, probably in my lifetime. And that was all due to Harry Reid because of his mastery of Senate procedure and understanding how to get hard things done. So this is a big loss. This is a legend. He is one of the last few remaining lions that we had in American government. And this loss is being deeply felt tonight.
You mentioned Senate rules. Senator Reid famously changed the rules of the Senate. Tell us what was behind that decision, and did he regret it?
Well, I think Senator Reid certainly was somebody who was not going to shy away from doing what needed to be done to do what the people of Nevada sent him to the Senate to do, but also remember in his role as leader to do right by that caucus that he ran. And, it's interesting, the time that I worked with Senator Reid, again, about a decade ago, historians have called it the most productive Congress in modern history. You look at the things that were accomplished just again in that time that I worked with him. When you look at the Affordable Care Act passage, you look at the passage of Dodd-Frank Wall Street reform, you look at the confirmation of multiple Supreme Court justices, the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the passage of the DREAM Act. As you can tell, this is pretty personal to me, but it's also a legacy that touches so many Americans from so many backgrounds. Again, he was a son of the West, and he was somebody who represented Nevada through and through and was the embodiment of that state, the son of Searchlight Nevada. But he also crafted and maintained a legacy across the country, across ethnicities. There are folks from all backgrounds whose lives have been improved because of the advocacy and the work of Harry Reid.
You called him a champion. Tributes are pouring in on Twitter. Chuck Schumer said he was one of the most amazing individuals he ever met. The governor said that Senator Reid will be missed, but his impact will be felt in Nevada forever. How do you think his legacy will continue to be remembered as in the days to come?
Let's talk about Nevada for a second. It's a state that, most people think of Nevada, they think of casinos in Las Vegas. They don't think of political power players. You mentioned in your intro Harry Reid coming from this hard scrabble background as a son of a hard rock miner in Searchlight, Nevada, and somebody who really, again, crafted a legacy at the local level. He was the Nevada Gaming Commissioner, and he put Nevada on the map in a lot of ways around the country. Again, most people think of Nevada, they think of Las Vegas, but the political legacy and the political identity of that state, it's all Harry Reid. And you look at just, even in the time that he has stepped away from the public scene and public spotlight as the Senate Majority Leader, but also Senator Nevada, he still cast a large shadow over that state. The political Democratic organization in that state still ran through Harry Reid until today, till the day that we lost him. And, his loss will be deeply felt. But again, there's such a bountiful legacy to look back upon. And I think generations of Nevada politicians will really kind of kneel at the altar of Harry Reid and the work that he did. I just don't think you can overstate his legacy. You can't overstate the productivity as Senate Majority Leader, but also, again, the time before Senate Majority Leader. I mean, he was represented in pop culture before he was Senate Majority Leader. There's a famed movie, Casino, that Robert De Niro starred in, where Harry Reid, one of the characters, was based upon Harry Reid as Nevada Gaming Commissioner. So he's somebody that has such crossover relevance and significance to the American people.
Towards the end of his political career, Senator Reid's relationship with Senator McConnell was quite strained. Did the two men ever smooth things over?
Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell probably looked at each other and saw mirror images of themselves, because these are both individuals. And look, your viewers, this doesn't matter at this moment as we're eulogizing Harry Reid, but these are men that did not agree on much. And look, I'm a Democrat, so you're probably not going to get a ton of nice words about Mitch McConnell from me, but these are both men who kind of cut their teeth understanding how that body, the U.S. Senate, works, a body that has changed a lot in the period of time that they joined it, both in the 80s, and they both rose the ranks of leadership. But I think they saw mirror images of each other. Reid's legacy is pretty significant now as we're looking at a presidency and the Biden presidency where he's screaming out for congressional leadership from Democrats. And, just as an alumni of Harry Reid and as somebody who kind of had a real close perspective on how he governed and how he led as Senate Majority Leader, it'd be really interesting to see how he would manage this moment in history that we're in with, the president's Build Back Better agenda, really hanging in the balance. And you saw the recent work on the infrastructure bill. One of the things that I was kind of wistful seeing over the last few months is, what would Harry Reid have done? What are the strategic moves that he would have made? And by the way, he would have ruffled some feathers. I'm saying a lot of flowery, nice things about this man, but he knew more than anybody that politics is not tiddlywinks. And it's a rough and tumble sport, and it ain't beanbag. And he played it tougher than anybody.
Had you talked to him in recent years about how he would handle things?
I had not had a chance to individually speak to him, but as a part of the alumni network, there were a number of gatherings that he would pull together to, check in on how folks were doing, kind of keep in touch, celebrate accomplishments of those who had gone on to do great things. There's actually a member of the Harry Reid Alumni Network that had recently passed away, and so he pulled folks together to honor that gentleman's memory. But we kept in touch, and by the way, I'll just tell you, there is a pretty significant group of individuals as a part of that alumni network who are at all parts of leadership of government, political infrastructure on the Democratic side, who all, again, learned at the knee of Harry Reid. I could go on and on naming the individuals who worked for that man. Kristen Northman is the current communications director of the Democratic National Committee. She worked for Harry Reid for a number of years. One of the most skilled, communicators in the party. Adam Jettleson, another one of the more skilled communicators in the party, worked for Harry Reid as a colleague of mine who I worked for on another political campaign. Folks like Jim Manley and Rodell Molyneux, David Crone, John Summers. These are individuals who are they make up like the nameless morass of government officials, but these are folks who learned at the knee of Harry Reid.
What do you think that says about him as a man, him as a politician, the fact that these people would continue to stay in touch with him and move on to do other things?
I think what it says is that his legacy speaks for itself. Again, in your lead-in, you talked about they recently named that airport in Las Vegas. They renamed it from McCarran Airport to Harry Reid Airport. I'm so glad that he got to experience that in his last days. I'll tell you, I have a hunch that it's not the last thing that'll be named after Harry Reid. There are buildings on the Capitol complex. There are rooms. There are physical orifices in that Capitol complex that'll be named after Harry Reid. You mark my word. The gentleman was he was something else. He was a force of nature, and I'd argue the most consequential Democratic majority leader in the last half century. I mean, he and LBJ. I think you'd have a hard time finding Democrats who had more impact and had more lasting legacies than those two.
Senator Harry Reid was also somewhat rare, a Mormon who was a Democrat. How did his faith define him?
Well, it's an interesting story about his faith. Reid actually converted to the Mormon Church, as actually a part of when he met his wife Landra, his wife of more than 50 years, Landra Reid, who obviously is grieving tonight. But he converted to the Mormon faith as a part of that, and I know that he was. There's actually a good number of Mormon political leaders still in the United States Senate and the United States House, and Harry Reid was among obviously the most notable. But I'll just tell you this: he was a man who, despite being tough as nails and taking no prisoners politically, really and truly also was a good, decent man. He was not of airs. He was not somebody who was highfalutin. He really was the son. I mean, he was the son of a hard rock miner of Searchlight, Nevada. One story I've got to share with you and your viewers. I was a deputy press secretary for Leader Reid, and so that job really consisted of me being the primary writer for the staff. And I remember one day I wrote a speech. It was a little bit too highfalutin and too fancy, and the feedback I got was, make sure that when you write for me, that it's written in the voice of somebody who understands the people he represents, that I'm not just Harry Reid, the Senate Majority Leader, but I'm Harry Reid of Searchlight, Nevada. And never losing touch with those individuals that he represented, I think, was a really important part of what he wanted to bring to his job. And, anybody who just wants to really understand that man should go take a pilgrimage out to Nevada, take a pilgrimage out to Searchlight, see the humble beginnings that he came from, and you'll really understand who he was and how his legacy will live on.
A lot of nice sentiments. Joel Payne, thank you for sharing.
Thank you for allowing me to.